Oh, so now we are moving on to the cardiovascular system. Today we're going to be talking about the heart, and then next week we'll start on blood and blood vessels. Okay, so let's talk about why the function of the cardiovascular system. So the reason we have blood and the reason we have our heart is so that we can move things around the body. So the function of the cardiovascular system really is for transportation. That's how you get any things from one part of the body to another part of the body. Things like nutrients that are coming off of the digestive system, gases, oxygen coming in, carbon dioxide going out through the respiratory system, the hormones coming off of the endocrine system. That's how they get to their target cells so they can create a response in the body. So hopefully you just realized that I just mentioned 3 other body systems. And so one thing I really want you to keep in mind, especially for these lectures, is that even though we talk about body systems as if they're completely separate, they really are very, very integrated. And that's especially true for the cardiovascular system because it's going to touch and interact with so many other different body organ systems. Okay, it also is involved in redistributing bodily fluids so that you don't have accumulation in any one particular spot. Accumulation in one spot is called edema. And so it just is basically just swelling. And so what you want to do is you want to make sure that the fluids in the blood and the fluids in the extracellular spaces, they're nice and balanced with each other. Okay, so let's get into where is the heart? The heart is going to be located in the thoracic cavity. And remember that the boundary between the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity below would be the diaphragm right there. So there is the diaphragm. The heart is going to just sit right on that diaphragm, and it's going to be off to the left side. Here is the general shape of the heart. It's a little bit like a upside down triangle. Whenever you see the pointy side of an organ, multiple different organs, we saw this with the cochlea and the senses, the pointy side is called the base, and the flatter side is, the pointy side is called the apex, and the flatter side is going to be called the base. So this side of the heart would be the base, and this side would be the apex. The apex is going to be off to the left side. You can find the apex if you go down between the 5th and the 6th rib. Right there should be where the apex will be. Okay, so it's very, very much off to the left side in the thoracic cavity, because right here, that would be where the sternum is right there. Okay, so let's look at the structure of the heart, starting with the layers surrounding it. When you open up the thoracic cavity, you open it up, what you're going to see is not actually the heart yet. The heart is surrounded by the pericardium, also known as the pericardial sac. So I kind of go back and forth with those 2 terms. It's the same thing. So pericardium or the pericardial sac. And so the heart will be enclosed in this tough sac, and that sort of protective layer surrounding it, it makes its own body cavity. And that's why the heart is said to be in the pericardial cavity in the thoracic cavity. That's because that pericardium creates the separate cavity within the thoracic cavity. Okay, so that structure that surrounds it has 2 layers. It has a tough outer layer, and usually has some fat sticking on the outside. The tough outer layer is called the fibrous pericardium, fibrous as in dense fibrous connective tissue. And then lining the inside of the fibrous, and the inside layer of the fibrous pericardium is going to be the parietal pericardium. And you've seen these words before. Remember when we talk about serous membranes, they come in pairs. You have the parietal one is going to be lining the body cavity. And so if the fibrous pericardium is creating the cavity, the parietal pericardium is going to be lining the inside of that cavity. Then there's a little kind of space. That space is called the pericardial cavity, and that's going to have some serous fluids that are secreted by both the parietal pericardium and then also the visceral pericardium. Okay, so the visceral pericardium is going to be, The visceral pericardium is going to be the second serous membrane, and remember, visceral means lining the organ itself. So the visceral pericardium will be really stuck on the outside of the heart. And another term for visceral pericardium is epicardium. You can for sure use that word term, epicardium. I actually prefer to just go ahead and stick with visceral pericardium since we already learned that before, but if you want to, you can also use epicardium. It's the same thing to me. Okay, so you have the parietal pericardium and the visceral pericardium. Those are the paired serous membranes. And remember, the function of all serous membranes is to secrete that fluid so that you can reduce the friction, so that as the heart is contracting and beating, it's not going to wear away at the surrounding organs. Okay, so it lubricates to reduce the friction. Okay, so the majority of the wall of the whole heart is very, very muscular, and the majority of the wall of the heart is a layer called the myocardium. Myo, what does myo mean? Myo means muscle, okay? And hopefully you remember that from when we talked about the muscle structures. So myocardium, that is this thick layer of cardiac muscle, and that makes up the walls of the heart, and that's what's responsible for contracting to beat the heart to make the blood flow. Okay, and then the last one we need to talk about is the endocardium. The endocardium is going to line inside the chambers of the heart. Okay, so the heart has these, sort of chamber, like empty rooms, chambers, and those are going to be lined with the endocardium. Now, I do like to describe this in a slightly different way for those of you who want to have something better to visualize. I like to think of the pericardium sort of like a lunchbox, right? So if you've got the lunchbox with the shiny insides, so the outside, for example, here, this blue outside here, the cloth part of the outside of the lunchbox, that would be the fibrous pericardium. It's the tough one. That's what makes sort of the structure of the lunchbox. And then that shiny layer inside of the lunchbox, that would be similar to the parietal pericardium, because the parietal pericardium is lining the inside of the fibrous pericardium. And then you got a little space there where your lunch can go. And here's your lunch, that would be the heart, and lining your lunch would be the visceral pericardium. Okay, so remember, visceral directly on the organ itself, parietal lining the cavity wall. Okay, so in that myocardium, we have the cardiac muscle tissue. Hopefully you remember what it looks like. Remember that it has those very long cells, and those cells are branching. They're also multinucleated. That's why you see all this nuclei here. And they have these special cell junctions where they come together. They're called gap junctions, or also known as intercalated discs. You've seen that term before, and that helps transmit electrical signals directly from cell to cell, so that when one of the cardiac muscle cells begin to depolarize to which was the signal for contraction, that depolarization is going to spread to all of the surrounding cells, and that's going to help coordinate the contraction so that all of those cardiac muscle cells are contracting at the same time, and that's how you get that coordinated single beat that's going to allow the blood to flow. Okay, so remember those intercalated discs. Okay, also the myocardium, the inside layer of the myocardium is going to fold itself over to create little textures, basically. And the name of that texture folds depends on which chambers you're in. If you're in the atria, see these folds here? Those are called pectinate muscles that make that textured wall of the atria. Whereas the ventricles also have these large folding too, but those are called trabeculae carneae. Trabeculae carneae, so remember the extra E, carneae, and that creates the textured wall in the ventricles. And then also in the ventricles, you've got these really large mounds of muscle, and they're going to anchor the valves that are found in the ventricles. So those mounds of muscle are called papillary muscle. Remember, papillae means mound, so that's where the name comes from. So the papillary muscles are going to anchor the valves and the valves are going to be anchored by these little strings called chordae tendineae. Okay, so the mounds of muscles are papillary muscles, but all of the other textures, the ones that are not connected to strings, so no strings, those are going to be the trabeculae carneae. Carneae like meats, trabeculae like folds. Okay, that's enough for now. Go on to the next one.